We remember the Crusades as holy wars, knights, crosses, and the fight for Jerusalem. But underneath the religion, they ran on something far less holy: money. These wars for God invented the modern bank, imposed some of the first war taxes in European history, and produced one holy crusade that turned into the largest debt collection operation of the age, a crusade that ended up sacking a Christian city to settle a bill. This is the story of how the wars for heaven built the machinery of modern money. If that's your kind of history, subscribe. This is War Economics. Start with a problem nobody mentions in the heroic version. Crusading was staggeringly expensive. To go on crusade, a knight had to fund himself, his armor, his war horses, his weapons, and years of travel across a continent and a sea. This could cost several times a knight's annual income, an almost impossible sum. So, across Europe, tens of thousands of nobles did the only thing they could. They mortgaged or sold their lands, very often to the church and its monasteries, to raise the cash to march east. The result was one of the largest transfers of wealth and property in medieval history, flowing steadily from the warrior class into the hands of the church, which was helping to preach the very wars that were making it rich. And it wasn't only individuals who had to pay. Kings needed enormous sums too, and to get them, they reached for a tool that should sound familiar from every other war on this channel: taxation. In 1188, to fund the Third Crusade against the great Muslim leader Saladin, the rulers of England and France imposed what became known as the Saladin tithe, a tax of 1/10 on people's income and movable property. It was one of the most sweeping taxes medieval Europe had ever seen, and it reveals the truth beneath the banners. Even a war declared holy was, at bottom, a financial problem. You could not fight for God without first raising the gold. And out of that simple, brutal fact that crusading meant moving vast amounts of money across a dangerous world came one of the most important inventions in the history of finance. Because the most dangerous part of a pilgrimage wasn't the praying, it was the cash. A pilgrim or a crusading lord carrying gold across thousands of miles of bandit-infested roads was a walking target, likely to be robbed long before he ever reached the Holy Land. And a brotherhood of warrior monks came up with a solution so elegant it would quietly rewire the financial world. They were called the Knights Templar. Hold on to that name, because the most powerful bank in medieval Europe was about to be founded by men who had taken a personal vow of poverty, and it would be destroyed 2 centuries later in a single dawn. The Templars were founded around the year 1119, just after the First Crusade, to protect pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem. But their real genius wasn't military, it was financial. Here's the system they built. A pilgrim in Paris or London could walk into a Templar stronghold and deposit his money. In return, he received a coded document, a letter of credit, recording the value of what he'd handed over. He then traveled to the Holy Land, carrying no gold at all, just a piece of parchment, worthless to any thief. And when he arrived in Jerusalem, he presented that letter at the Templar house there and withdrew his money in local currency, minus a small fee. Deposit in one country, withdraw in another. If that sounds familiar, it should. It is essentially the ancestor of the traveler's check, the modern check, and the international wire transfer. The Templars had built, in the 12th century, the world's first international banking network, a web of fortified branches stretching from the Atlantic coast all the way to the River Jordan. Quick pause. This is exactly what this channel is built for. The money machinery underneath the history everyone thinks they know. If that's your thing, subscribing genuinely helps the next one get made. Now, how a brotherhood sworn to poverty became the richest institution in Christendom. Because once you have a trusted network that can safely hold and move money across the known world, you don't stay a courier service for long. People trusted the Templars. They were holy warriors, exempt from local taxes and answerable only to the Pope. and that trust made them the safest place in Europe to keep your wealth. So they began doing everything a bank does. They took deposits, they made loans, they managed estates, they acted as financial advisors to the most powerful people alive. Kings and popes banked with them. The King of England stored the crown jewels in the Templars' Temple Church in London, using it as a high-security vault. The Pope himself borrowed from them. At one point, the French royal treasury, the entire wealth of the French crown, was physically kept and managed at the Templar headquarters in Paris. A partnership of monks sworn to poverty had become, in effect, the first great multinational corporation, a tax-exempt financial superpower with branches in every kingdom, holding the money of Europe's mightiest rulers. Remember that, because that immense wealth was about to make them a target. But before we get to their fall, we have to see the single most shocking example of what money did to these holy wars, a crusade that never reached Jerusalem because it turned into a debt collection raid. In the year 1202, the Fourth Crusade set out, called by the Pope to recapture Jerusalem. The Crusaders needed ships to get there, so they struck a deal with the greatest naval power of the age, the merchant republic of Venice. Venice agreed to build an enormous fleet, hundreds of ships, to carry an army of over 30,000 men in exchange for the colossal sum of 85,000 silver marks. Venice held up its end and built the fleet. But when the Crusaders assembled, only about a third of the expected army actually showed up. And with far fewer men, they couldn't come close to paying the bill. They found themselves stranded in Venice, tens of thousands of marks in debt, with a massive fleet they couldn't afford. Now, Venice was not a charity. It was one of history's most ruthless commercial powers, and the aged doge who led it, Enrico Dandolo, was not about to forgive a debt that size. So instead of writing it off, Venice repossessed the only thing the Crusaders had of value, their swords. The doge offered a deal: work off your debt by fighting for Venice. And so the Holy Crusade was pointed not at Jerusalem, but at targets Venice wanted. First, the Crusaders were sent to attack the Christian city of Zara on the Adriatic coast, a city that had defied Venice, sacking it as a down payment on their debt. This was the first time a crusading army had ever sacked a fellow Christian city, and the Pope was so appalled he excommunicated the entire expedition. But it got far worse. Lured on by a Byzantine prince who promised to pay off all their remaining debts if they helped him seize his throne, the Crusaders sailed next to Constantinople, the capital of Eastern Christianity and the richest, greatest Christian city in the entire world. When the promised money failed to appear, the debt-ridden, unpaid army did what unpaid armies do. In 1204, they stormed Constantinople and subjected it to 3 days of savage looting, killing, and destruction. They stripped the greatest city in Christendom of its treasures, its relics, and its art, much of it carried back to Venice, where some of it still stands today. An expedition launched to liberate the Holy Land had instead destroyed the beating heart of Christianity, and it fractured the Christian world in a way that never fully healed. And scholars who have studied it closely conclude the real driver behind the whole catastrophe was startlingly simple: the payment of an outstanding debt. And that points to the deeper economic truth of the entire Crusades. Because the people who truly won them weren't the knights or the kings, they were the merchants. The Italian trading republics like Venice and Genoa treated these holy wars as a business opportunity, and they made a fortune. They won the lucrative contracts to ferry armies and supplies east. They secured exclusive trade rights in the ports of the Holy Land. And above all, the Crusades blew open the trade routes between Europe and the East, the flow of spices, silk, sugar, and luxury goods that these merchants would grow spectacularly rich controlling. That surge of trade and wealth pouring back into Italian cities is one of the forces that would later help ignite the Renaissance. The wars were fought in the name of God, but the lasting profit went to the bankers and the traders. Which brings us, finally, back to those bankers, and to the most powerful debtor of all. By the early 1300s, King Philip IV of France was drowning in debt, much of it owed to the Knights Templar, who had helped finance his wars. Philip was broke, he was ruthless, and he looked at the Templars and saw two things he desperately wanted: their vast wealth and freedom from the enormous debt he owed them. And he found the oldest solution in the book. If you owe a great deal of money to someone, one way to erase the debt is to destroy the person you owe. So he made his move. At dawn on Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, in one of the most coordinated operations in medieval history, King Philip's soldiers simultaneously smashed through the doors of every Templar house in France. Thousands of knights were arrested in a single day with no warning. They were charged with a battery of fabricated crimes, heresy, idolatry, blasphemy, and then tortured until they confessed to them. Over the following years, many were burned at the stake, including, eventually, the order's Grand Master, Jacques de Molay. Philip pressured the Pope into formally dissolving the order entirely, and its assets were seized. The most sophisticated banking institution the world had ever seen was wiped out, not by a rival, not by a war, but by its own biggest customer, who found that murder was cheaper than repayment. And here's the detail that confirms what the whole thing was really about. When Philip's men burst into the Templar treasury in Paris expecting to seize a legendary hoard of gold, they found the vaults far emptier than they'd hoped. The bulk of the fabled Templar treasure and the order's records had seemingly vanished, and the mystery of where it went has fueled legends ever since. But the most damning fact came 7 centuries later. In 2001, a document known as the Chinon Parchment was rediscovered in the Vatican's own archives, and it revealed that the Pope's own investigators had secretly examined the charges and absolved the Templars of heresy back in 1308. In other words, the Church privately knew the accusations were false almost from the start. The heresy was never the point, the gold was. It is a pattern this channel has seen again and again across the centuries. When the debtor is powerful enough, the safest place to store your money is nowhere near him. And some say it's why, to this day, Friday the 13th is considered a day of bad luck. So here is the whole arc in one line. Wars declared for heaven were funded on earth by mortgaged land, by the first great war taxes, and by a network of warrior monks who invented international banking to move the money. Those wars made merchants rich, turned one crusade into a debt collection raid that gutted the greatest Christian city on the planet, and ended with a bankrupt king burning his bankers alive to clear his tab. The Crusades failed to hold Jerusalem, but in trying, they built the foundations of modern finance: the bank, the check, the war loan, the war tax, the very machinery that every war since has run on. That's the pattern this whole channel exists to expose. Every war has a second front made of money. And the Crusades are where that front first took the shape we'd recognize today, proving that even a war for God is, in the end, a war for gold. If you made it this far, you're exactly who War Economics is for. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next ledger.